So our third guest for today, we're very honored to have with us Pantelis Golitsis, who is assistant professor of ancient and medieval philosophy at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and is also a fellow at the Einstein Chronoi Center of Berlin, about which I hope he will tell me because I was unaware of its existence until now. Pantelis is a former colleague of mine at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, and since our co-studies, he's become one of the world's most eminent authorities on Neoplatonism. He is the author of Les commentaires de Simplicius et de Jean Philopon à la physique d'Aristote, Tradition et Innovation in 2008. He has especially done very important work on textual criticism, paleography, the establishment of texts. He's done a critical edition of Aristotle's Metaphysics Lamba in 2001, on the progression of animals, also in 2021. A new edition of Alexander of Aphrodisias' commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, 1 to 3, also in 2021. In other words, he is one of those people who publishes so much that the rest of us become ashamed. But instead of trying to compete with him, I will simply allow him to speak. Pantelis, if you would like to speak. The topic of Pantelis' talk is Invisible Now and Indivisible Time, Damascius' conception of time progressing by leaps. Pantelis.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mike, for this introduction, but flattering introduction. Thank you so much. Perhaps I should say, for those who are barely familiar with Damascius, that he was the last Platonic successor. This means that he was the leader of the Platonic school at Athens in 529, when the Emperor Justinian banned the teaching activities of that school. He's a very important philosopher in many respects. His philosophy of time is one of them. There are many novel things about Damascius' philosophy of time. I will first give an outline of his theory, and then I will focus on the particular topic of my talk, namely his conception of time as progressing through leaps. This necessitates, of course, an adequate understanding of what Damascius means by leap, jumping. Jumping is not like the arrows of flying, or the tortoise is walking, or Achilles is running. Now, in order to understand Damascius' philosophy of time, we have to bear in mind a very important metaphysical distinction that he makes. He distinguishes between the activity that proceeds from the essence of a thing and the very activity of being this thing. A human being, for instance, has various mental and psychocorporeal activities that proceed from its essence, from what it is to be a human being. But it also has an activity of being the human being that it is. It does not have all of this activity at once. On the contrary, her or his activity of being is extended. A human being comes to be continuously from being an embryo, or if you prefer, a newborn baby. An embryo does not have a rational soul. Ancients and can hardly be qualified as a human. From being a newborn baby to being an old woman or an old man until it perishes. This means that, like every other sublunary substance, a human being has its being in becoming. As it becomes and goes through the various stages of being a human being, what does it do? It evolves, Damascius says, around an irradiating intelligible form. And in order to do so, it necessitates earlier and later stages. The role of time, Damascius says, is to order these earlier and later stages. That is, to make them earlier and later. In the absence of time, they would be confused. Now, this function of time already appears in the Greek word for time, which is chronos, which was thought by the Neoplatonists to derive from the expression choreia to nou, dance around the intelligence, dance around the intelligible form. To put it in McTaggart's analysis of the nature of time for those who are familiar with it, the fundamental temporal series is not the A series, as McTaggart thought, namely the placement of an event in time as variously future, present, and past, but is the B series, namely the unchangeable earlier and later. The activities of being, and therefore also the various events that pertain adventitiously to the activities of being, acquire the future and the past, as the generated substances actually go in an unchangeably ordered way through the earlier and later stages that make up their durative activity of being. How is this happening? Damascius's reply is that this is happening because of the activity that proceeds from the essence of the first generated substance. Generated in a Platonic context does not necessarily mean created in time. It means being not self-constituted, not being self-constituted. An intelligible form is self-constituted. And what is the first generated substance? The heaven. And what is the essence that proceeds from the first generated substance? The rotation of the heaven. The rotation of the heaven creates the days and nights which appear on Earth and which are necessary for the being of any sublunary substance to have a duration and therefore a past and a future, which is what it needs to have in order to perish, which is what is good for it if it is to be eternal, not numerically, of course, but in species. Therefore, the being in becoming, which characterizes the sublunary substances, is the result of two components. First, time as a perfecting element, which articulates the earlier and later within a durative activity of being, and two, the rotation of the heaven, which makes an activity of being actual, which grants it, if you like, a presence, which makes it happen in the present time, or in a present time, which is flowing. It is this flowing time and the way in which it flows, which is the main topic of my talk today. But before coming to this, let me add one more thing about Damascius' philosophy of time, perhaps the most noble. The heaven itself is a generated substance. And if it has an activity that proceeds from its essence, namely its rotation, it must also have an activity of being. Damascius is the only Platonist to claim that the movable image of eternity, as Plato describes time in the Timaeus, is not the flowing time, that is, the time that runs along with the rotation of the heaven. Or, to be more precise, the flowing time, according to Damascius, is an image of the image of eternity. The first and true image of eternity is what he calls o sympas chronos, the whole of time, which pertains not to the activity that proceeds from the essence of the heaven, but to the heaven's very activity of being. What can this mean? The being of the heaven does not properly come to be. It does not go through earlier and later stages, and therefore it requires no past or future. The heaven is eternal, I mean, the universe is eternal for the Greeks. The heaven's being actually coincides with its becoming because of this integral time, whereas in the sublunary substances, they are having their being in becoming is to have an extended activity of being which is ordered because of an extended time. Therefore, the extension of the activity of being of the heaven need not surpass the flowing time that pertains to its rotation, that is, the extension of the flowing present, that is, as we will see, a single leap of time. If time is a movable image of eternity, as Plato says, this is only because the essence of the heaven is moved accidentally through its activity. The time that came into existence along with the heaven, as Plato further says in the Timaeus, is not the flowing time, which is an activity, but is the whole of time, which is an essence. And for any Platonist, an essence is always ontologically prior to an activity. Let me now come to the image of eternity, which is the flowing time that progresses through leaps. Damascius' conception of the flowing time, we can also say the flowing present, is shaped by a creative reception of three things. Aristotle's concept of the now and its relation to time, as expounded in Physics 4 and 6. Plato's discussion within the second hypothesis of the Parmenides of the one becoming and being older as it moves forward in time, and to a lesser extent, the Stoic definition of time as an interval concomitant to the motion of the cosmos, which Damascius, however, following Iamblichus, takes to be the second part of the most ancient definition of time, purportedly given by the Pythagorean Ahitus in the treatise on all on the universal reason, which we, unlike the Neoplatonists, know that it is pseudepigraphos. The purported definition of time by Ahitus as a number of a certain motion or a universal interval of the nature of all brings together the Aristotelian and the Stoic definitions of time. Damascius's merit is to have brought together all these theories of time, or rather to have distinguished between the Aristotelian take on time and the Platonic take on time, and to have articulated these different takes into a coherent doctrine, which he thinks leads to our grasping the true nature of time. Actually, although he makes large use of the word diastema, which is not used by Plato, Damascius does not think that he was following a particularly Stoic doctrine, because he traces the conception of time as an interval back to Plato's Parmenides. His strategy for giving to all this coherence is to show first that if one is to arrive at a correct understanding of Aristotle's take on time, one should read Physics 4 together with Physics 6. Second, that there is a rather cryptic discussion of the true nature of time, with which Aristotle was not very much concerned in Plato's Parmenides. And third, that these two different takes are distinct, have to be distinguished, but they are not contradictory. They are complementary. Aristotle, Damascius explains, addresses in his Physics the indivisible now, which exists only in the human soul. And we should actually start our investigation from the way in which the now is at first cognized in us, in the human soul, in the human mind. Whereas Plato, in the Parmenides, addresses the now as the present time, which exists in nature and whose flowing creates duration. Now, Aristotle says that time is divisible in parts according to the now, and that no part of time subsists. This is posited in Physics 4.10 as a serious difficulty, since for any divisible thing to exist, Aristotle explains, either all of it or some part of it has to exist, but no part of time exists. The past no longer is, the future is not yet, and the now, the present moment, which seems to exist, is not a part of time. Time is not constituted by moments or instants, as a line is not constituted by points. We know that Aristotle shows in the following chapters of Physics 4, at least this is what I think, that these and other related difficulties cease to be real once we have understood the true nature of time. Time, which is a concomitant of motion, which in its turn is a concomitant of space, is continuous. Therefore, it has no parts. That is, it has no actual parts. Time is never actually divided by itself. It is the human intellect that actually does the dividing by individuating instants as anterior and posterior cuts in something's motion. Remember that Aristotle defines time as a number of motion according to the anterior and posterior. According to Aristotle, time measures, metrei, there's one word for this thing, measures, one Greek word I mean, the being of motions, measures the being of motions, thus creating their duration, and numbers arithme the motions, thus creating a number of motion, say a day, a month, a season, a year, a 4-year cycle or Olympiad, in virtue of the human soul. Time and instant, we can say today, were for Aristotle mind-dependent entities. Aristotle, it seems to me, believed that time, unlike the continuum of space and motion, is not a basic ingredient of the universe. Time emerges from items, the past, the future, and the present instant that separates them, that do not exist except in the human soul. It is not obvious at all that Aristotle believed that other living beings, say the planet Saturn, had a past and a future. And this was also Damascius's contention, but for different reasons. For a concordist Platonist, such as Damascius, Aristotle appeared to claim that time does not exist outside the human soul, only to superficial readers who were unable to see that the now, which is the anterior and posterior in Aristotle's definition of time, is not the only now that exists. By presenting time as ontologically dependent on motion, Aristotle's definition of time could not concern the true nature of time, but only the way in which time is at first cognized in the human soul. The true recognition of time, however, requires us to distinguish the indivisible or partless now, which is a limit of time, from the present time, which is continuous, and as any continuous entity in this world, is infinitely divisible, but only in thought. In reality, it is indivisible. Damascius criticizes those peripatetics who do not read Physics 4 in the light of Physics 6, a book in which Aristotle purposefully shows, to the detriment of Zeno's paradoxes, that nothing moves or changes in the indivisible now. There can be no instantaneous motion. It would be contradictory for a thing, for a divisible thing such as motion, to be realized or exist within something indivisible, such as the instant. And yet time, this movable image of eternity, is inseparable from motion. Movable. Damascius says, in a Platonic vein, that time coexists and runs along with motion. Quote, I am astonished at how those who say that only the indivisible now exists solve Zeno's argument by claiming that motion is not accomplished according to something indivisible, but rather progresses in a whole stride at once, and that it does not always cover the half before the whole, but sometimes, as it were, leaps over whole and part, but did not realize the same thing happening in the case of time. For time always coexists with motion, and as it were, runs along with it, so that it strides along together with motion in a whole continuous jump, and does not infinitely traverse a series of nows. And they do not realize this, while on the one hand, motion is evident in things, and on the other hand, Aristotle has clearly shown that nothing moves or changes at the now, but only has moved or has changed at it, whereas no doubt things are changing and are moving in time. At any rate, the leap of motion, being a part of motion which occurs in the course of moving, will not be moving at the now, nor will that which is present occur in a time that is not present. So that in which the present motion occurs, this is the present time. And it is infinitely divisible, just as motion, for each is continuous, and everything continuous is infinitely divisible. Language can here help us to understand what Damascius thought Aristotle's point was. The difference between the progressive and the perfect aspect of the verb captures what really is the case with motion and its relation to the now, that is actualized by the human soul. It is with a view to this relation that Aristotle affirms in Physics 6 that a thing, I quote, cannot be changing at the now. It is necessary that at every now it has changed. At the indivisible now, a thing has moved or has changed. That is, it has accomplished a part of its motion, as this part is actually individuated in a percipient mind, whereas it is moving and is changing in time. To the detriment of Zeno's paradoxes, a motion should be compared to a leap. It covers at once a continuous spatial distance. Surely, jumping can hardly be conceived as divided, that is, as progressing step by step. But Damascius takes a further step. He says that so is also time. He says that a leap, which does not take place at the now but in time, is present when it takes place in the present time. This, the enestos chronos, is the time that, unlike the nune, as an extensionless limit, exists outside the human soul in the world of nature. This is the now whose flowing creates duration. According to the Neoplatonic philosopher, when something moves, it does not move successively part by part, thus covering the half before the whole, but covers with its motion both whole and part. In other words, it covers a whole that is not actually divided in parts, but once it is covered, becomes itself a part of the continuum, a part, however, that does not remain in the case of time. Covering both whole and part is for Damascius a central concept for understanding the true nature of time. Time, he invites us to think, is a measure composed by a ceaseless plurality of measures that come and go, each one of which is, as he says, an undivided divisible. Time, therefore, we could say like a quantum, is both continuous and discrete. Quote, time does not progress according to instants because it could then not even progress, since instants are always infinite in number. But just as motion progresses by intervals and not by points, but so to speak by leaps, as Aristotle also said, so it is necessary that time also advance by whole measures, which become suitable for measuring the leaps of movement. Damascius detects the conception of leap in Aristotle's account of motion and its relation to time in Physics 6. His intuition, however, comes from the Platonic dialogue that he's here commenting on, namely the Parmenides. Within the conclusions reached in the second hypothesis of the Parmenides, the namesake Platonic persona makes a crucial for Damascius distinction. He shows that his interlocutor must accept that the one is distinct from the many, which is what the discussion in the Parmenides is about. While the one moves forward in time, does not only become older than itself, but also is older than itself. Quote, this is a really important passage. Plato. And it is older, is it not? When in becoming, it gets to the point of time between was and will be, which is now. For surely in marching from its being once to its being thereafter, it cannot skip the now. No. And when it arrives at the now, it ceases to become older and no longer becomes, but is already older. For if it went on, it could never be reached by the now. For it is the nature of that which goes on to touch both the now and the thereafter, letting go the now and seizing the thereafter. While it comes to be between the two, that is, between the thereafter and the now. True, but if that which is becoming cannot pass the now, when it reaches the now, it ceases to become and is then whatever it may happen to be becoming, clearly. And so the one, when in becoming older, it reaches the now, ceases to become and is then older, certainly. We are now landed in a conception of the now substantially different from Aristotle's. Plato thinks that as a thing becomes, it does not merely move from the past, the was, to the future, the will be, but is constantly between a now and a thereafter. If it is only in the thereafter, it does not become, but will be. If it is only in the now, it does not become, but is. The conception of an extended now, what the Stoics will later call diastema, interval, thus emerges. Of course, whatever becomes is not between a now and a thereafter in the way in which the now itself is between the once and the thereafter, but is between insofar as it touches both the now and the thereafter. The now then has a part in which the thing that becomes is. For if it were in the whole of the now, it would be only in the now and therefore would not become but be. And which it lets go, and thus this part of now turns into and once, in order to seize the thereafter, which it was previously touching by moving towards it, and which by being not merely touched, but seized, turns into a renewed part of now. But if the now has a part, then it is extended. This passage of the Parmenides is extremely important in one more respect. Plato thinks that as the one marches from the past to the future and thus necessarily arrives at the now, it then ceases to become older. That is, it no longer becomes older, but is already older. In other words, as the thing that becomes moves forward to the thereafter, the part of it which is in the now does not move, but stands still. Otherwise, it would not be now. Insofar as the thing that becomes is moving, it touches the thereafter and not the now. This contention introduces the idea of the present time, or enestos chronos, as pending, which is what enestos literally means, pending, begun but not completed. Actually, time is never completed. As the thing that becomes moves forward in time and thus reaches the now, it is then, Plato says, what it happens to be becoming. In other words, it has accomplished a stage or a part of what it is becoming. We can trace in this analysis of the Parmenides the origin not only of Damascius' conception of time as being both continuous, insofar as it becomes, and discrete, insofar as it is, but also of the conception of the thing having its being in a becoming. The persona Parmenides further insists that since the one must be and become in a time equal to itself, it also has the same age as itself. Damascius goes on to explain that this occurs whenever the one is in the now. Quote, its interval of time is called now in the sense of the present time, and not in the sense of the limit of time. For there is a certain interval of time which has been present all at once and is not distinct in virtue of two nows. This refers to Aristotle's conception. Time is what is between two indivisible nows. And further, moreover, that which becomes progresses in becoming, but stops and stands still in being. Again, the idea of being and becoming. Like motion, stationariness for the things here is in time. Therefore, that which is stationary in time, just as that which becomes is moving in time. Hence, the now too is an interval of time, and time is made out of such intervals. Therefore, through the succession, and as it were, the motion of such intervals, time becomes always other, while through the abiding of its interval in a way as a whole, that which is always in one time, just as that which becomes is always in a different time. This was Damascius' solution to Aristotle's dilemma with regard to the nature of now. Aristotle asks, is the now one and the same, or is it always regenerated? In pertaining to the gignomenon, that which becomes, time measures a duration that is generated through a succession of intervals or extended nows. The being, however, which is in becoming, the on, that which is at its interval at halt and is thus measured by one and the same now. This is the now which is called non-flowing, nunto ariston, in this fragment from Damascius' own place. Quote, it has become clear to us that there are three measures of three partitions or divisions. There's no other type in generation except these three, and no other measure. For the indivisible is also threefold. There is the monad, the now, and the point. The material division of the monad, or to speak more accurately, of the one, creates plurality, which is defined, which is delimited by a certain number, like the single thing, which is delimited by the monad, that is what is undivided in number. The flow of the now creates duration. I call now that which does not flow in the now of the flowing time, like the accomplished motion as beginning of motion with regard to motion. It was allotted to the now of time to measure this non-flowing now, and to time to measure its flowing, as it was allotted to number to measure plurality. Damascius resumes in this text his doctrine about the three partitions that occur in generation and the three uniting measures, that is number, time, and place, which intervene in order to give unity to these partitions. Measure is meant here not as a cognitive tool, as is meant by Aristotle. Say a month is our knowledge of the duration of the orbital period of the moon, or roughly of the motion of the sun from one zodiacal constellation to the next one, but is meant in the sense of ontological principle of unity. Number is the measure of the division of the indivisible. Unity, place is the measure of the extension of the indivisible point, and time is the measure of the duration of the flowing now. But what exactly is the non-flowing now, which is measured by the now of time, that is Plato's now, which through its flowing creates the duration measured by time? It is surely not Aristotle's indivisible now, which is only a limit brought about by the human soul. It must be, I quote Damascius' commentary on the Parmenides, the one time in which that which is always is as it becomes. This may seem difficult to grasp, but we may tackle it by taking as an example myself, who am a male human being. In becoming, I go through the various stages of what it is to be a generated human being. As I become, I am a small child, then a youth, then a young man, then a senior, and finally an old man. These are the 7 stages of life divided into 7-year periods. I move forward in my becoming by reaching successively all the stages of a generated human being. This is of course true, but only partially. For I become continuously by evolving around the intelligible essence of humanity, according to, as Damascius says, the leaps of generation, which are measured by the flowing now. If time progresses through leaps, so must do generation. At each stage and at each leap, however, I am always a human. I stand still because of a non-flowing now. Thus, the Parmenides teaches that time has essentially a double nature. It is both flowing and stationary, both continuous and discrete. Every one of us partakes in a present time, which is unceasingly flowing and therefore temporalizes extrinsically our duration, that is, the extended activity of our being, say, our temporality, which is ordered by the time immanent to our generated essence. Like the extension of our activity of being, our generation occurs through leaps. But unlike the sum of these leaps, a single leap, a leap by itself, is ungenerated. Quote, certainly, even the leaps of generation, being such, that is indivisible, cannot be generated. For if they were generated, they would be infinitely divisible. And in this way, generation could never progress to an end. This is why the leap of generation is not generated. That is, with regard to the very aggregation of progression. This is why it is also called being on if compared to the generation composed of the leaps, just as the leap of time is called now if compared to time, which is composed of these leaps. A single ungenerated leap of generation relates to generation as the non-flowing now relates to temporality, that is the sum of the flowing nows that compose it. The nows that are not flowing structure the existence of every substance having its being in becoming. They appear as once and thereafter, and are indeed such within the temporalization that reigns over the sublunary world, but they are altogether present in the unmattered form. In other words, the participation itself, which makes a participating sensible substance participate in an intelligible form. Remember Plato's Phaedo, there is the largeness itself, the largeness in simias, and simias who is large. The unmattered form is not mixed with matter and has therefore to be carefully distinguished from the common form, that is the form of the matter form composites. While such compounds, such matter form compounds are becoming, their temporality is structurally altogether present in the being of the unmattered form. This explains the fact that the order of the life stages and of any generated substance, the life stages of any generated substance is always the same for any living being belonging to the same species. Time, therefore, is an active power of ordering, at least on two levels. As a measure immanent in the compound, and it is then made out of the flowing now of time, and as a measure immanent in the unmattered form, and it is then a non-flowing now. I have one more slide, but I think I should stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.